In this lecture I want to look at the very basic, essential principles that apply to Islamic geometric design. And I mean this in a very practical way. How are geometric compositions made? That's what we'll be looking at today, and it'll form a basis for the other lectures that will follow after this. I thought it would be nice to use an example of a geometric pattern, but one that doesn't contain the familiar stars and arrows and petals and kite shapes, because it's a better way to explain it. So let's have a look at this very well-known stone mihrab. It's an Abbasid mihrab, very old, and if we zoom in on the area that I've highlighted in red, we can have a look at that pattern and have a closer look at what we can see there. We can see the bow tie shapes, I could call them. Some of them are horizontally aligned and some of them are vertically aligned. We can have a look at the same pattern again in this Jali screen in India, in Agra, which is the same pattern but made several hundred years later. And we can see the same bow tie shapes, vertically aligned and horizontally aligned. So the question is here, how would you design something like that? How would a craftsman make something like that? If we look at both objects, we can see that they are made more or less for a rectangular shape. And we can also see, especially in the case of the Jali screen, that at the sides of the screen and at the bottom of the screen, the shapes are nicely cut in half. So this is a essential principle of Islamic geometric design that we'll see many more times, and which you will be able to recognize yourself as well. That when you see a Islamic geometrical composition, almost always it will be in some sort of rectangular shape with horizontal and vertical lines, and the way that the craftsman has designed it is very specific. It's not just randomly chopped off to make it fit into, in the case of the Jali screen, into a stone window frame, but it's designed to fit. It has to fit. And the way craftsmen did that, that's one of the main things that we'll be talking about in this lecture and in this course as well. But before we get to that, let me show you some sequences of drawings, which you'll become more familiar with as this course progresses, because it's the way that I try to teach Islamic geometric design. It's the way that I think is probably closest to the way that craftsmen made their compositions. Craftsmen weren't mathematicians. They used a compass and a ruler to make geometric patterns. And that's also what we will be doing in this lecture, and that's also how I teach it in my book. You can see a square divided into 8 equal sections with a circle, and then in that circle here are placed 2 squares. Those 2 overlapping squares give certain intersections, which in this case are indicated with red squares, and with those intersections we draw these red lines. The blue and the red circles indicate where the lines pass through. So red lines like that, and then red lines like that. And maybe you can already recognize when you look at this what we've drawn here. In the middle, of course, we can clearly see one of those familiar bow tie shapes, and then there's shapes surrounding this central shape which are maybe to the untrained eye less familiar or less clear what they are. It only becomes clear what these shapes are is when you tessellate it, when you put it in a grid of squares in this case. Lots of squares with the same pattern all next to each other. When you do that, you create this composition, the one that we saw earlier. That, in a nutshell, is the principle of Islamic geometric design, certainly in the way that I teach it. It's the practical principle of it, that you design a pattern that fits into a polygon, so that can be a square, as is the case here, or it can be a hexagon, or it can be a variety of different shapes. And that polygon, that square or hexagon or other shape, is then tessellated, repeated, and it creates a bigger composition. But at the basis of it, certainly for this composition, it's just a simple grid of squares. And if you keep that in mind, and it also helps you understand how craftsmen were able to design compositions that had to fit into a particular space, like a window, a stone window frame, like we see here. Because if you know that the window frame is going to be, for example, 150 centimeters wide and 250 centimeters tall, for argument's sake, you could then design a grid of squares that would, for example, be 3 columns wide, each column being 50 centimeters wide, so 3 times 50, 1 meter 50, and could be 5 rows tall, so 5 times 50 centimeters is 250 centimeters. Essentially, that's how craftsmen were able to make their compositions, and how they could calculate how big their pattern had to be, or how big the elements in their composition had to be before they started. And that's also a very essential principle of Islamic geometric design.